The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer. Picture yourself walking down a dusty medieval road. The sun warms your face as you crest a hill, and suddenly, there it is. A cathedral rising before you, like something from a fever dream. This isn't just a big building. It's absolutely massive, hundreds of times larger than anything else on the horizon, completely dwarfing the stone walls encircling the city below. As you get closer, you feel this mix of wonder and excitement. You can see the grand gatehouse with its two 50-foot towers, and a statue of the king painted in brilliant colors standing watch over the entrance. It's magnificent, powerful, awe-inspiring. And then your nose catches up with your eyes. About 400 yards from the gate, the road crosses what was probably once a pleasant little stream. Now, well, let's just say the locals probably call it something like Shitbrook. And for good reason. The banks are piled high with broken pottery, animal bones, human waste, and rotting meat. As you watch in mild horror, two men casually dump another barrel of excrement into the water. A pig roots happily through the garbage nearby. Welcome to a medieval city. It's a place of absolutely wild contrasts. One moment you're staring at sublime beauty and architectural genius, the next you're stepping over literal filth in the streets. High art meets low crime. Deep faith walks hand in hand with crushing poverty. It's wealth and stench, sophistication and squalor, all crammed together. Now here's the really fun question. What if you could actually go there? Not just read about it in some dusty textbook, but actually walk those streets. What would you wear? Where would you sleep? What would you eat? And honestly, how would you survive? Most history books give you the what happened version of events. Dates, names, battles. The past is a closed case, a story that's already over and done. But today we're doing something completely different. We're exploring a book that treats the past not as something dead and buried, but as a living, breathing place you can actually visit. The book is The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England by historian Ian Mortimer, and it's brilliant. This isn't your typical history book. It's a genuine handbook for visitors to the 14th century. It invites you to step out of your comfortable present and experience another time with all your senses. I'm going to be your guide on this journey, and by the end, you won't just know some facts about the Middle Ages. You'll actually have a feel for what it was like to be alive in a world that is, as Mortimer puts it, a foreign country where they do things very, very differently. Let's start our journey the way any traveler would, on the road, approaching one of England's great cathedral cities. As we've already seen, the first thing that hits you is these absolutely wild contrasts. The cathedral scrapes the sky like a monument to human ambition and faith, but at its feet, the city is messy, chaotic, and intensely human. As you pass through those imposing gates under the painted king's watchful gaze, you leave the stench of garbage-choked streams behind, but you're immediately hit with a new assault on your senses. The quiet countryside is replaced by this symphony of urban chaos. Laborers shouting, street vendors calling out their wares, 30 different church bells ringing, and just constant human chatter. Dirty-faced boys with tangled hair might run up to grab your horse's reins, offering to find you a room for the night, their clothes and feet caked with mud from the streets. It feels incredibly alive. You'll see priests in their robes, merchants showing off silks and expensive fabrics, peasants guiding pack horses loaded with grain. Maybe a Dominican friar is preaching on a street corner to a small crowd. The air is filled with vendors crying out, "Hot piece cods," or "ribs of beef," and many a pie. It's overwhelming in the best and worst ways. But this vibrant world has a genuinely dark side. Look up at those city gates. You might see blackened heads of criminals stuck on poles, their eyes long since plucked out by birds. You might see severed arms and legs of traitors hanging by ropes, covered in maggots. These gruesome displays are constant, stark reminders of the king's power and the brutal nature of medieval justice. This is the real medieval England. High art and decaying flesh, deep faith and profound fear, all existing side by side. Here's something that might surprise you. These bustling cities were actually tiny. Exeter, for instance, had only about 600 people in the late 1300s. Even London, by far the largest city in England, had only around 40,000 inhabitants. Compared to the great European cities like Paris or Florence, English cities were pretty small potatoes. So why do they feel so crowded and chaotic? Because the city acts like a magnet for the entire surrounding countryside. On any given day, the population could double or even triple, with travelers, merchants, clergymen, messengers, pilgrims, and local farmers coming in to buy and sell. A city was the only place to find specialized services: lawyers, scribes, apothecaries, spice merchants. On market days, or during fairs, the streets would be so packed you'd be constantly jostled by the crowds. It's this constant flow of purposeful people that makes a medieval city feel so vibrant and alive. So where would you actually live in this city? The variety of housing is as extreme as everything else. On the main streets leading from the city gates, you'll find handsome three-story houses belonging to wealthy merchants, their shops open on the ground floor. But turn down a small alley, and the world transforms. The upper floors of houses jut out over the street, almost touching, blocking out sunlight. These alleys are dark, damp, and often filled with kitchen rubbish and overflowing buckets of waste. Go even deeper into the warren of streets, and you'll find a maze of tiny lanes, sometimes only 3 or 4 feet wide. Here are the poorest dwellings, single-story timber shacks subdivided into small rented rooms with no proper foundations, no toilets, and roofs covered in moss. The people living here spend almost their whole day out on the street, working, eating, living in public. Their children are those urchins who greeted you at the city gate. What's striking is how much of the city isn't even for living. Inside the walls, a third of the area might be taken up by monasteries and religious precincts, each with its own high walls. Add the royal castle and the parish churches, and you realize the entire population is squeezed into about half the city's space, with the wealthiest citizens occupying the best locations. It's a city of walls within walls, a society of strict divisions made real in stone and timber. But no city in England compares to London. It was the richest, most powerful, most diverse city in the kingdom, and also the smelliest, most polluted, and most violent. It was the permanent seat of government, where Parliament met and the king's officials worked. For a visitor, London was completely overwhelming. The sheer number of fine houses, wide streets, and bustling markets was astounding. The River Thames was crowded with hundreds of boats and large ships from as far away as the Mediterranean. The streets were filled with people from all corners of Christendom, dressed in fine velvet and satin. Yet London's problems were as immense as its grandeur. With tens of thousands of people and no sewage system, the city was overrun with filth. The streets were thick with foul-smelling mud mixed with animal dung, rotting vegetables, and the guts of butchered animals. Rats were everywhere. Wild pigs roamed the city ditches, feeding on garbage. It was a constant struggle for city authorities to maintain any kind of public health. Imagine a city where thousands of animals were slaughtered daily in residential areas, their blood and guts flowing into the streets. You could find a perfume shop situated right next to a tannery, one of the smelliest trades imaginable. The contradictions were absolutely wild. But to truly understand this world, we need to look beyond the cities into the countryside, where the vast majority of people actually lived. If you traveled through the English countryside in the 14th century, the first thing you'd notice is that it doesn't look like our neat patchwork of small fields. Instead, you'd see massive, irregularly shaped open fields, some over 1,000 acres, with no hedges or fences. Within these huge fields, the land was divided into individual strips, like a giant set of allotments, each farmed by a different family. The whole leave a field fallow thing is a bit of a myth. Instead, they'd leave certain sections within the great field fallow, while planting wheat, oats, and barley in others. Around these enormous fields were common grasslands for grazing sheep and woodlands for firewood and timber. Every inch of this landscape was carefully managed. The trees themselves would be different. Very few evergreens, so the winter skyline was pretty bleak. You wouldn't see pine, spruce, and fir trees. Those were mostly imported from Scandinavia. The forests were filled with oak, ash, elm, and hazel. And forget about seeing any gray squirrels. They hadn't arrived in Britain yet. The cattle and sheep would also be much smaller than their modern counterparts. As you wander through these woods, you might wonder about dangers. Are there wolves? Probably not. The last English wolf was likely killed in this century, and you'd be incredibly unlikely to meet it. The only truly dangerous beast in 14th century English forests was man. Gangs of armed robbers roamed the highways, which we'll get to later. This landscape wasn't static. It was constantly changing. Rivers silted up, turning prosperous ports into ghost towns. The coastline eroded. Storms could wipe out entire towns in a single night. The climate itself was shifting. At the beginning of the century, you could buy English wine from local vineyards. By 1400, a slight drop in average temperature made the weather wetter and colder, and all the vineyards were gone. But the biggest agent of change, the one that reshaped the entire landscape and society, was disease. Starting in 1348, waves of plague, what we now call the Black Death, swept across the country, depopulating entire villages. When a third of a manor's workforce died, the lord couldn't collect his rents. The surviving tenants, suddenly in high demand, might leave to find better-paying work elsewhere, even though it was illegal. A lord could lose all his tenants in months. Faced with useless land, he might abandon farming altogether and turn the entire manor into grazing land for sheep. Across the country, you'd see thousands of acres of well-tended farmland turn into grassy fields in just a few years, with a ruined church tower as the only reminder that a community once thrived there. By the end of the century, over 1,000 villages had been deserted and lay in ruins. This brings us to the people themselves. Who were these individuals living in this dynamic, dangerous world? First thing you need to understand, there were far, far fewer of them. England's population was about 5 million in 1300. By 1400, after waves of famine and plague, it had been cut in half to around 2.5 million. It was a demographic catastrophe on a scale that's hard for us to even imagine. And the people themselves were incredibly young. Today, the median age in England is around 38. In the 14th century, it was just 21. Half the entire population was 21 or younger. A staggering 40% of the people you'd meet would be under 15. This youthfulness had a profound impact on society. It was a more violent, more impulsive, and rawer world. Responsibility came at a shockingly young age. Boys were expected to work from age 7 and could be hanged for theft at the same age. They could marry at 14 and serve in an army at 15. Edward III led an army into battle when he was just 20. His son, the Black Prince, commanded a battalion at the Battle of Crecy when he was only 16. For women, life was even more accelerated. A woman was considered in her prime at 17, mature at 25, and growing old by her mid-30s. Most girls of good birth were married by 16 and had given birth to 5 or 6 children by their mid-20s, though 2 or 3 of those children would likely have died in infancy. And of course, many of these young women were widows, their husbands killed in the constant wars with Scotland and France. How did they see their own society? They divided it into 3 groups, or estates, created by God: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work the land. Those who fight were the aristocracy, a pyramid of power with the king at the top. Below him were the great lords, dukes, earls, and barons, who held their land directly from him and formed the House of Lords. Below them were thousands of knights and gentlemen who were the local lords of manors. Their job was to protect the other 2 estates. Those who pray were the clergy. Another powerful hierarchy, from the archbishops of Canterbury and York down to parish priests. The church was a massive institution, owning vast amounts of land and wielding immense influence. Beyond local priests were the regular clergy, monks and nuns, who withdrew from the world to live lives of prayer in abbeys and priories, and friars who went out into the world to preach. Here's a surprising fact. About 2% of all adult males in England were clergymen. Finally, there were those who work, the peasantry. This wasn't a single, uniform group. There were as many grades of wealth and status among peasants as there were among the aristocracy. The biggest division was between freemen and the unfree, known as villeins or bondmen. A villein was legally tied to his lord's land. He worked on the lord's fields several days a week in return for the right to farm a few strips of land for his own family. But legally, everything he produced, everything he owned, except, as one abbot grimly put it, his own belly, belonged to his lord. He couldn't leave the manor for more than a day. He couldn't marry his daughter to someone from another manor without paying a fine. If he died, his heir had to give the lord his best animal. It was basically a life of servitude, not far removed from slavery. The only ways out were to be granted freedom by the lord, or to run away. If a villein could escape to a town and live there for a year and a day, he'd become legally free. This three estates model was neat and tidy, but it left a lot of people out. Where did merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, and doctors fit in? What about servants, mariners, and entertainers? These people living outside the traditional structure were some of the most interesting you could meet. A servant in the king's household held more authority than a wealthy merchant, and a rich international trader in London, with a fortune comparable to a knight's, hardly fit the image of a simple worker. And what about women? They weren't usually defined by what they did, but by their marital status: maiden, wife, nun, or widow. From birth until widowhood, a woman was legally under the control of a man, first her father, then her husband. She couldn't own property independently, borrow money, or even make a will. Society was deeply prejudiced against women, a bias rooted in religious texts and ancient philosophy. They were often blamed for the moral weaknesses of society, seen as intellectually inferior and physically deformed men, according to Aristotelian thought. This led to a deeply flawed understanding of female sexuality. It was widely believed that women had a physical need for regular sex to stay healthy. In marriage, this meant neither partner could deny the other. But for an unmarried woman or a victim of assault, the consequences were devastating. Because it was believed a woman had to experience pleasure to conceive, if a woman became pregnant after being raped, the law often concluded that no rape had occurred. It was cruel and impossible. However, a woman's life wasn't just one of victimhood. They were exempt from military service. A high-status woman shared the power and respect of her husband's position. A widow, especially a wealthy one, could achieve significant independence. In cities, a woman could carry on her husband's trade after his death, becoming a tailor, merchant, or even an armorer. The second richest person in all of 14th century England was a woman, Queen Isabella. And while the law was stacked against them, a spirited woman, like Chaucer's famous Wife of Bath, could certainly hold her own against her husband. So you've arrived in this strange new world, you've seen the landscape and met the people, but how do you actually function here? How do you survive day to day? This is where the real challenge for a time traveler begins. First, language. In 1300, if you couldn't speak French, you commanded little respect. The king, his lords, the clerks, and all the official classes spoke French. English was the language of common people. But over the course of the century, this completely changed. Edward III took pride in speaking English, and in 1362 he decreed it could be used in court. By 1400, Henry IV claimed the throne in English, in Parliament, in front of all the lords and bishops. English had become the language of the nation. But it wasn't the English, it was a language of many different dialects. A man from the north would have great difficulty understanding a man from the south. And writing was another matter altogether. If you gave evidence in English in court, it would be written down in Latin. Financial accounts were also kept in Latin. French remained the language of polite society and international communication for much of the century. And the language you'd hear on the street was direct, earthy, and often crude. Terms we'd consider shocking were just part of everyday speech. Next, how do you tell time? There are no watches. Before the first mechanical clocks were introduced in the 1350s, people told time by the sun. The day was divided into 12 hours from sunrise to sunset, and the night into 12 more. This meant a daytime hour was much longer in summer than in winter. You'd tell time by looking at a sundial or judging the length of shadows. When the first large turret clocks were built in cathedrals and palaces, they introduced a new kind of time, the hour of the clock. These clocks didn't show time with hands. They announced it by ringing a bell, so you had two systems running at once, solar time and clock time. For most people in a town, the most important timekeepers were the church bells, which rang out for prime, the first hour, terce, the third hour, noon, and vespers. As a traveler, you'd need to pay close attention to the final bell of the day, curfew. When it rang, city gates closed, taverns shut their doors, and anyone found on the streets without a lantern was likely to be arrested and spend the night in a very unpleasant city prison. What about money? The basic unit was the pound, but there was no pound coin. The currency was made up of small silver coins, pennies, halfpennies, and farthings. It took 12 pennies to make a shilling and 20 shillings to make a pound. In the middle of the century, Edward III introduced the first successful gold coin, the noble, worth a third of a pound. This made large transactions much easier than weighing out hundreds of tiny silver pennies. Prices were relatively stable, but in times of famine they could skyrocket. And after the plague, when there was a surplus of goods and a shortage of people, prices plummeted. How do you behave? Manners were incredibly important. The medieval world was violent, but that didn't mean it was without etiquette. In fact, showing proper respect was a matter of survival. When you entered the house of a social superior, you'd leave your weapons at the door. You'd never enter a man's hall without permission. When you came before a lord, you'd kneel. Before the king, you'd kneel 3 times. You'd never speak until spoken to, and you'd never, ever turn your back on a social superior. At the dinner table, the rules were just as strict. You washed your hands before every meal. You cut your bread. You didn't break it. You wiped your mouth before drinking from a shared cup. The idea of knights gnawing on meat and throwing bones on the floor is complete fantasy. Politeness, or courtesy, was a sign of your breeding and your respect for your host. Now, what would you wear? This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the 14th century, because men's fashion changed more radically in this period than in almost any other. In 1300, both men and women wore long, loose tunics that hung from the shoulders. Status was shown through the quality of fabric and richness of color, not the cut. But around 1330, a revolutionary invention changed everything: the button. With buttons, clothes could be tailored to fit the body snugly. They no longer had to be pulled over the head. This led to a dramatic divergence between male and female clothing. Men's clothes became shockingly revealing. Tunics got shorter and shorter, until by the end of the century, a fashionable young nobleman might wear a doublet, called a court piece, that barely covered his hips, showing off the full length of his colored hose, or tights. The outlines of men's bottoms became visible, to the horror of conservative chroniclers. Shoes became absurdly long and pointed, with a style called the krakow being so long the tip had to be tied to the garter at the knee to prevent tripping. Women's clothing, while also becoming more tailored and figure-hugging around the waist and hips, remained floor-length. A noblewoman might wear a tight-fitting gown called a cotehardie, with a low neckline and sleeves buttoned to the wrist. but her legs and arms were never exposed in public. The focus was on her face and headdress. Married women wore a wimple, a cloth that covered the hair, neck, and chin. Unmarried girls wore their long hair in elaborate plaits, often wound into ram's horns over the ears. Clothing was also a powerful symbol of social order. Laws called sumptuary laws were passed to prevent people from dressing above their station. Only the wealthiest lords could wear the most expensive furs like ermine. A servant girl who wore a hood trimmed with anything other than lambskin or rabbit fur could have it confiscated. Your clothing announced who you were, what you did, and who you served. After a long day's travel, you'd need a place to stay. Your options depended on your social status and your luck. The most obvious choice was an inn. But these weren't cozy, welcoming establishments. They were rough-and-tumble businesses run by tough, no-nonsense innkeepers. You'd ride into a courtyard, and a stable boy would take your horse. The main hall would be a large, high-ceilinged room with a fire in the center and trestle tables along the side. The floor would be covered in rushes, often mixed with stale food, spilled ale, and whatever mud was trodden in from the street. The sleeping arrangements were communal. You'd be led to a chamber with several beds, and you'd be expected to share a bed with 2 or 3 other men. The beds themselves were simple wooden frames strung with ropes, with a straw mattress on top. You'd likely be kept awake by the snoring of your bedfellows, the barking of the inn's guard dogs, and the sounds of drunken travelers stumbling around in the night. A much better option, if you could get it, was to stay in a private house. The home of a prosperous merchant could be as spacious as an inn but far more comfortable. You'd find feather beds, glazed windows, painted wall hangings, and a display of fine silverware. You could also stay at a monastery. Monks had a religious duty to offer hospitality to travelers. A nobleman would be invited to stay in the abbot's private lodgings. A lesser traveler would be shown to the guest house, a simple hall with straw mattresses. But the great advantage of a monastery was its sanitation. Many had advanced systems of running water, and even flushing drains for their latrines, a level of hygiene unheard of in most inns. Finally, if you were of high rank, you might stay in a castle. The 14th century was a great age of castle rebuilding. Old, gloomy fortresses were being transformed into luxurious palaces. They were designed to impress and entertain as much as to defend. The heart of the castle was the Great Hall, a vast space with a high timbered roof, tiled floors, and painted walls. Life in a great household was lived on a massive scale. A powerful lord like John of Gaunt had over 100 people in his household, not including his armed retainers. A meal in the Great Hall was a spectacle of social hierarchy, with the lord and his most important guests seated on a raised dais, and servants and lesser members of the household seated at long tables below. What would you eat and drink on your journey? This is where you'd encounter another stark contrast between the lives of the rich and poor. For the peasantry, food was a constant struggle. Famine was a real and recurring threat. In a bad year, people would be reduced to eating grass, acorns, and even bark from trees. The staple foods were dark bread made from rye, or a mix of grains and pottage, a thick stew of peas, herbs, and whatever vegetables were available from the garden. Meat was a luxury. A peasant's living animals were far more valuable for what they produced, milk, wool, and eggs, than for their flesh. A cow or an ox was a vital piece of farm equipment. The most common meat for a peasant was salted or pickled herring. Ale was the universal drink, consumed by everyone, including children. It was weak and brewed at home. Water was generally avoided, as it was often contaminated. In towns and cities, the diet was more varied if you had money. You could buy prepared food from cookshops and street vendors. Fresh meat, including young lamb and kid, was more readily available. White bread became more common. And the markets of a major city like London offered an astonishing array of imported luxuries: wine, sugar, almonds, and spices, like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger. But these were incredibly expensive. A pound of saffron cost more than a skilled craftsman would earn in 3 weeks. For the nobility, Dining was a form of theater. A meal at the Lord's table could last 2 hours and consist of 3 main courses, each with multiple dishes. The first course might be boiled meats in rich, spiced sauces. The second course would be roasted flesh, featuring exotic birds like swan, peacock, and heron, each carved in its own specific way. The third course would offer the most delicate meats and baked fruits. All of this would be washed down with fine wines from France and Spain. But there was a rhythm to this feasting. The church forbade eating meat on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, and during the long periods of Lent and Advent, in total, for more than half the year. On these fish days, the nobleman's table would be laden with an incredible variety of fish, from salmon and sturgeon to porpoises and even beavers, which were classified as fish because they lived in water. Finally, we come to the most daunting aspect of your journey: health and hygiene. In almost every respect, 14th century life was profoundly unhealthy. The very ideas about illness were completely alien to our modern understanding. It was widely believed that sickness was a form of divine judgment, a test from God to purify the soul. People were as likely to pray for a cure as they were to see a physician. It was also believed that diseases were caused by miasmas, corrupt air created by unfavorable alignments of the planets. Physicians, who were rare and incredibly expensive, based their diagnoses on humoral theory. They believed the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness was caused by an imbalance between them. A doctor might diagnose you by inspecting the color and smell of your urine, or even tasting your blood, and then consulting an astrological chart to decide on treatment. The remedies themselves could be terrifying. They often involved purging the body through vomiting or enemas. A common treatment for almost any ailment was bloodletting, either by cutting a vein or applying leeches. And the medicines prescribed could be bizarre concoctions of fried dung beetles, the heads of fat bats, or a bath in water boiled with blind puppies. Surgeons were more common than physicians. They could set broken bones, remove teeth, and stitch up wounds. The best surgeons, like the famous John of Ardern, used anesthetics like opium and hemlock to put their patients to sleep during operations, but even they believed in astrological charts and the benefits of bloodletting. Cleanliness was a complex issue. While we might think of the Middle Ages as uniformly dirty, people did value cleanliness, but they defined it differently. Spiritual cleanliness, being free from sin, was often seen as more important than physical cleanliness. Still, people washed their hands and faces daily, and always before and after meals. The wealthy enjoyed luxurious baths in wooden tubs filled with hot water, herbs, and rose petals. For common folk, a change of clean linen was the most practical way to stay fresh. But no amount of personal hygiene could protect you from the great diseases of the age. Before 1348, the most feared disease was leprosy. Sufferers were cast out of society, forced to wear a cloak, and ring a bell to warn others of their approach. It was a slow, disfiguring illness known as the living death. And then came the plague. The Black Death was a cataclysm that destroyed medieval society. It arrived in England in 1348. And in less than 2 years, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. It was terrifyingly swift. You could go to bed healthy and never wake up, or you could develop a fever and the telltale black boils or buboes in your armpits and groin and be dead within 5 days. The sheer number of deaths was overwhelming. In London, 200 bodies were buried every day. Entire villages were wiped out. There was no cure. No explanation that made sense. Doctors could do nothing. Priests died while giving last rites to their parishioners. It was a trauma so profound, it shook people's faith in God, in society, and in the future itself. The plague returned again and again throughout the rest of the century, ensuring the population could not recover. So in this world of shocking contrasts, of brutal hardship and vibrant life, what did people do for fun? How did they find joy? The answer is, in many ways. First and foremost, Through music and dancing. Medieval people loved music. The quiet of the world made them more attentive listeners. Great lords employed troops of minstrels to play at their feasts, and even peasants in the fields played pipes and whistles. At village festivals, everyone would join in caroling, holding hands in a circle, and singing and dancing to bawdy songs. Plays were another popular form of entertainment. In larger towns, craft guilds would put on mystery plays, staging biblical stories on two-story wagons pulled through the streets. These were huge community events, and crowds would become passionately involved, watching the story of creation, Noah's flood, or the crucifixion unfold before their very eyes. At Christmas, lords and even the king would take part in, quote, mummings, elaborate costume parties with masks, music, and games. And then there was the joust. This was the ultimate medieval spectacle. Where else in history could you see the most powerful and privileged men in society risk serious injury and even death simply for entertainment and to prove their courage? A joust was violent and dangerous. Two knights in full armor, weighing over 80 pounds, would charge at each other on massive war horses with 11-foot lances aimed at each other's heads. The impact was ferocious. Knights were frequently unhorsed, breaking bones, losing teeth, or worse. While some jousts were jousts of peace with blunted lances, others were jousts of war with sharpened steel tips, where killing your opponent was part of the sport. Hunting was another favorite pastime of the aristocracy, a carefully guarded privilege. The king and his great lords spent vast sums on their packs of hounds and prized falcons. There was a strict social hierarchy to hawking. A king should fly a gerfalcon, a knight a saker, and a yeoman a goshawk. These birds were so valued that people would take them everywhere, even into church. For common folk, there were simpler games. Children played hoodman blind, a version of blind man's buff. At fairs, there were wrestling competitions, but the most popular sport was football. It was a wild, chaotic game, often played between two entire villages, with hundreds of people on each side, and goals that could be miles apart. There were no rules, and injuries were common. The authorities repeatedly tried to ban it, urging men to practice archery instead, which was not just a sport but a vital military skill. And finally, there was literature and storytelling. This was the great age of the birth of English poetry. Lords and ladies would have books read aloud to them in the evenings. The most popular stories were romances about King Arthur and his knights. But this century also produced some of the greatest writers in the English language. There was John Gower, a court poet who wrote vast poems in English, French, and Latin. There was the anonymous author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, perhaps the greatest Arthurian poem ever written, a brilliant tale of courage, temptation, and magic. There was William Langland, whose powerful poem Piers Plowman was a savage and passionate critique of the greed and corruption he saw in society. And then there was Geoffrey Chaucer, a vintner's son from London, a soldier, a diplomat, and a civil servant. Chaucer was a genius who absorbed the literary traditions of France and Italy and created something entirely new in English. His most famous work, The Canterbury Tales, is a masterpiece of human observation. He brings his characters to life with such wit, warmth, and psychological depth that they feel as real to us today as they did to his contemporaries. From the gentle, charitable prioress who weeps if she sees a mouse in a trap to the boisterous, 5 times married wife of Bath, Chaucer shows us the full spectrum of medieval life, without judgment, and with a profound and generous love for humanity. He, more than anyone, is our ultimate guide to this fascinating, contradictory, and deeply human world. So we return from our journey. We've walked the smelly, vibrant streets of a medieval city, seen the vast open fields of the countryside, and met the people who inhabited this world. So young, so violent, and yet so full of life. We've learned how to tell time by the sun, how to behave in the presence of a king, and what it might feel like to face the terror of the plague. What do we take away from all this? What's the great lesson of Ian Mortimer's incredible book? I think it's a profound lesson in empathy. The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England does more than just present facts. It forces us to shed our modern assumptions and see the world through the eyes of people who lived 700 years ago. It asks us to stop judging the past as simply dirty or cruel and start understanding it on its own terms. When we read about a mother beating her child, our modern instinct is to be horrified. But Mortimer helps us understand that in their world, a parent who didn't beat their child was seen as irresponsible, as failing to prepare them for a brutal world where a small theft could lead to the gallows. When we read about their bizarre medical remedies, we can laugh at their ignorance, or we can try to appreciate the desperation that drove them to try anything, mixing faith, magic, and scraps of ancient knowledge in a desperate attempt to fend off death. The book reminds us that history isn't a collection of dead artifacts in a museum. It's the story of living, breathing human beings who loved, feared, hoped, and struggled, just as we do. Their world was different, their knowledge was different, their values were different, but their humanity was the same. And this brings us to a simple, powerful action you can take. The next time you visit an old castle, a cathedral, or even just an old parish church, don't just look at it as a beautiful, silent ruin. Try to close your eyes for a moment. Try to imagine the sounds that once filled it, the music, the chatter, the prayers. Try to imagine the smells, the incense, the wood smoke, the unwashed bodies. Try to imagine the people who walked, those same stone floors, people for whom this building was not a historical monument, but the center of their world. By doing this, you're not just learning about history, you're connecting with it. You're practicing the kind of historical empathy that this book so brilliantly teaches. You're beginning to see the past not as something gone and dead, but as a living place, a foreign country that we can, with a little imagination, still visit. And in visiting it, we learn not only about them, but about ourselves. That was a summary of The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer. We've journeyed through the highlights today, but I'll be honest with you. A summary is like looking at a travel brochure. The real adventure happens when you take the trip yourself. The magic of this book is in the details, in the quiet moments, when a particular description or surprising fact makes you feel like you're truly there. This summary is designed to give you a taste of that journey and help you decide if this is a destination you want to explore further. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an immersive experience that can genuinely change the way you see the past and your own place in the long story of human history. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration of another life-changing book. Let's keep traveling through the world of ideas together.